Hi there, folks. In my last little talk, I spoke of the deeper current, the sense that beneath the swift surface of modern life, there is something quieter, older, and more patient. And I suggested that the Christian contemplative tradition is in part an invitation to become awake to that deeper current, to become attentive to Emmanuel, God with us. But there's a question we haven't really asked. If we're going to practice attention together, how do we hope to be together? Who are we to each other together? I think that's not a trivial set of questions, because contemplation isn't simply something we do alone. Certainly there is a way to practice becoming attentive to God, but there is also a way of becoming attentive to one another. It's been said that God is in the spaces we share, our communal connective tissue. And perhaps that's where community begins and judgment softens. So for our Thursday evenings, I've been thinking about something I'd like to call a covenant of attention. Now, when I say covenant, I don't mean a list of rules. I'm thinking about covenant in the older biblical sense, a promise about how we will inhabit a relationship together, a shared rhythm. Not, here are the things you have to do in order to belong here, but rather, here is a kind of community we hope to become. Because I don't think attention simply is about trying harder to notice. Sometimes it feels more like remembering something we already know, somewhere deeper than words. Remembering that we are here, remembering that God is here, remembering that we belong to one another and that we belong to this beautiful wounded world. And I think there are several movements within that covenant. So I will begin with the first covenantal movement, and that is that we arrive gently. Nothing is required except our presence. We're going to arrive carrying our actual lives. Some of us will come joyful, some exhausted, some grieving, distracted or hopeful, skeptical maybe. We may be having a wonderful day. We might be having an awful day. And that's all right. There's nothing to prove here. We don't have to arrive spiritually prepared. We simply come as we are. Perhaps arriving is itself a kind of remembering. We arrive. We arrive present to God. We arrive present to one another, or present to our feeling of God's absence, or present to the gift of simply being here. Gently, we encourage gratitude. And to the second covenantal movement, in that we honor silence. This may be one of the stranger things we do together. We're accustomed to filling silence with conversation, with music, with information, with our phones, sometimes even with prayer. But deep waters are rarely noisy. Silence is not absence. It is a depth. We don't have to manufacture it. We don't have to perform it. We simply make room for it. Perhaps silence helps us remember what all our noise has made difficult to hear. Sometimes silence becomes the prayer before words remember how to speak. Silence is a discovery. And our third movement, and that is we listen with our whole selves, not just with our ears, with memory, with imagination, with the body, with the heart, with whatever part of us is capable of noticing something before we've figured out what it means. When Scripture is read, we listen. When another person speaks, we listen. If a bird calls outside the window, perhaps we listen to that too. And when something moves within us, a memory, a feeling, tears, we'll try not to explain it too quickly. We'll receive before we interpret. Because perhaps attention is one of the oldest names for love. And to our fourth covenantal movement, we speak from experience. When we gather in what we're calling a wisdom circle, we aren't there to win an argument. We're not there to persuade one another. We're not even necessarily here to reach agreement. We speak as travelers describing a landscape we have actually walked. I noticed, I wondered. This is what happened for me. This is what I'm struggling with. You see, it's these kinds of sentences. An honest sentence offered with humility can sometimes nourish more deeply than a very polished conclusion. There's no need to be impressive, only real. Which brings us to our fifth covenantal movement, in that we leave room for mystery. We're not going to solve everything on Thursday nights. In fact, I hope we don't. Some questions are better companions than problems to be solved. Faith grows through clarity of mind, certainly. But it can also grow through our willingness to remain present when we don't have clarity. God's presence is often less like a spotlight than like dawn. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, and we may discover clarity of heart. Somehow everything begins to look different. The mystery isn't necessarily withholding itself from us. Perhaps it's patiently inviting us deeper. And that brings us to the sixth covenantal movement. We receive one another with compassion. Every person carries hidden waters, stories of joy, stories of grief, stories that haven't yet found words. So we practice curiosity before certainty, hospitality before agreement, listening before fixing. And again, the Gospels surprise us with this simple possibility. Christ may arrive wearing the face of another, a face we fail to recognize. We only see him with new eyes. So we practice paying attention, not only to what someone says, but to the person who is there. And on then to our seventh covenantal movement. We remember creation. We remember that our attention doesn't end with the people in the room. Creation is not merely the setting for worship. It is already praying. The river was singing before we arrived. The oceans hum. The maple grove has been harmonizing praise through its patient, communal, open-armed skyward reach. The wind knows prayers that require no language. And the heron, standing at the water's edge, keeps a kind of Sabbath we are only beginning to understand. As our attention deepens, the world slowly changes, or maybe we change. What was once mere scenery becomes communion, inviting us to his table. What was once merely nature becomes creation, begging our participation. And we begin to recognize the world not simply as something to use or even merely as a gift to appreciate, but as a living community through which the generosity of God continually flows. And this brings us to our final covenantal movement. the sending, we return. Because the purpose of Thursday night isn't to create a little spiritual bubble that lasts until we walk out the door. We come here so that we can return back to kitchens and classrooms, to hospitals and sidewalks, meetings and gardens, riverbanks and dinner tables, back into the complicated, beautiful, wounded world we actually inhabit. We return carrying no special status, just perhaps a quieter heart, a more generous imagination, a little more willingness, and a greater capacity to notice. Like streams returning to a watershed, we scatter into the world, not to possess the living water, but to become, however imperfectly, the open spaces where others need not thirst. We are the open spaces. This is what I mean by a covenant of attention, not a set of rules, not another thing we have to get right. A rhythm we can return to again and again. We arrive. We become quiet. We listen. We speak honestly. We make room for mystery. We receive one another. We remember creation. And then we return, not climbing toward God, not trying to manufacture some extraordinary spiritual experience, but learning to settle more deeply into the love in which we already live. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. Not where the kingdom will be, nor where it was. He directs our attention to where the kingdom is, in this moment, and this. Perhaps that's what we're practicing. Not becoming experts in contemplation, but becoming apprentices in attention. And perhaps the first requirement of attention is simply this: to become quiet enough to hear. And that's where we'll go next week, in our next conversation. Grace and peace, friends.